Who am I to call myself native when Daniel can trace his roots in this place back centuries?
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a weekly podcast sharing the stories of a place known as Utah's Dixie, and brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation. Through stories as universal as they are personal, this podcast is dedicated to the memory of legendary family physician Dr. Craig Booth and to defining, preserving, and perpetuating the spirit of Dixie embodied in his life and work.
Hi, I'm Lyman, host of the Not Forgotten podcast. For more than 40 years, I've been writing and publishing with the intent of connecting landscape and story in the American Southwest. I believe the words spoken by a character in a story by Barry Lopez. Everything is held together by stories, he said. That is all that is holding us together, stories and compassion. Dr. Craig Booth was a man of stories and compassion. His personal story is one of the many that have made Utah's Dixie what it is, and his compassion is at the heart of that elusive entity we call the Dixie Spirit. In today's episode, I want to look back at who was here before my ancestors came here. You know, I've always, through all the years that I've been writing about this area, I've always thought that I can't begin to talk about the history of this area without starting with the actual history of this area, and that includes the people who were here first. And today's episode is called They Were Here First. If we go back 1,000 years to the ancestral Puebloan people, or what we called the Virgin River Anasazi people who lived along the Santa Clara Creek and the Virgin River, and then in recent centuries, over the past millennia, the Paiute people, the Southern Paiutes, and specifically the Shivwits Band of the Paiutes, who lived in this very valley, in the very places where our homes sit, and camped right where the Sun Bowl sits, where they had their winter camps, and then in the summertime they were out on the Arizona Strip in the high country, out toward the Grand Canyon. But I don't feel like we can go further in this podcast without talking more about who was here first and who is still here, because the Paiute people are still here. They're a vibrant and wonderful part of this landscape that has been theirs for centuries. And so today I want to share a couple of pieces relating to that, and also include the voice of a dear friend, Karma Grayman, who is a member of the Shivwits Band and who is a Southern Paiute, and who is one of the few people who still speak the Paiute language. And so you'll hear her voice as we proceed through these stories as well.
Ayak nu punikai maanoni im tangwansing mamautsing. Ayak imipich ivanto tuvipur nuni tuvip nu kaivatsing sivitsing mamautsung nu kanikant maba.
First, I want to share something with you called Fitting the Story Together. It is a fresh spring morning in the valley. A new home is taking shape on a gentle rise above the creek. Set near the edge of a ridge, the home's location offers a magnificent northward view of the lava-capped mesas, red sandstone ledges, and towering blue mountain with trailing white hints of winter. Below the home runs the constant flow of the creek. each bank hugged by newly planted fields. The morning sky is streaked with thin, wispy clouds, and the sun is lifting, warming the creosote-carpeted hillside. It is time to go to work, time to close in the roof and finish the floors and plaster the walls. A common St. George morning, 1,000 years ago. One morning, early in the spring, many years ago, I exited Bluff Street onto Hilton Drive and headed for Southgate Golf Course. As I made the sweeping right turn south of the auto dealerships, I took in the panorama across the north-facing hills from Tonnequin, where the Santa Clara River spills into the Virgin, all the way to Green Valley. The bottomland was lined with a beautiful golf course, the hillsides capped with magnificent homes. Driving on, I crossed the golf course bridge that spans the narrow current of the Santa Clara. From there, my gaze swept from Fairway Hills across the driving range and up the next ridge, where a new development called Lava Point Estates was beginning to form. And beyond the last home, I saw two bright blue pickups parked in the brush near the edge of the hill. Out in the bushes, beyond the trucks, I saw what looked like several grown men and women puttering in the dirt. I drove toward them, passing a line of 20 or 30 brightly dressed golfers practicing tee shots, passing the fresh 2x6 frame of a gigantic house in progress on the ridge above, and on up to the Lava Point turnoff. At the end of the asphalt, I stopped and watched for a moment as the people out in the bushes scraped, shoveled, and sifted through the soil. Finally, I got out of the car, camera and notebook in hand. Walking off the black asphalt and onto the gray earth, I stepped out of this century, out of this millennium, and entered a time and place of mythic proportions. The man named Gardner Daly was seriously possessed by his task. He was standing more than waist deep in a small, round, rock-lined hole. His back was to me, and he was tossing shovelful after shovelful of rich brown earth off the edge of the hill to the north. I watched him for a while, fully aware that he worked for the government, and I was content for a moment to witness some of my tax dollars being put to what I felt was meaningful use. When I spoke, he stopped and slowly turned. He smiled and reached out his hand to shake mine, the kind of handshake you can expect only from someone who logs part of his day on a shovel. He spoke slowly and distinctly, giving each sentence the thought it deserved. The small talk ended quickly, and we began to speak of who had once resided here, how they lived, what they ate, where they might have come from, and where they might have gone. Gardner Daly stood in the hole, an ancient ancestral Puebloan or Anasazi storage cyst lined with large, flat slabs of gray stone. I squatted at eye level with him. He carefully stated the facts of this site, the fourth site that he and fellow BLM archaeologist Douglas McFadden had uncovered in 3 winters there at Southgate and Lava Point. He was careful to share only what the evidence showed him and not venture too far into speculation. A master's degree from the University of Utah and a lot of ground covered toward a PhD had tempered his tendency to want to say more than what the physical evidence could bear out. Studying ruins and artifacts tells us an awful lot about the what, where, and how of these people's lives, their technology, their diet, their living habits, Daly said. But it tells us little about their feelings, their thoughts, their ideology, the why of it all. I suppose the Anasazi liked these ridges for many of the same reasons we do today, said Daly. I suppose they appreciated being up where they could see the landscape around them, see their fields of corn and beans and squash in the creek bottoms below, plus the fact that they were up above the bugs and the snakes. I don't know how interested they were in the aesthetics of the view, but they certainly had some beautiful views, which is what makes these lots so valuable to today's developers. Daly and his associates were pushing to stay one step ahead of the bulldozer blades in an effort to learn everything they could about the least known population of the storied ancestral Puebloan people. Of all the divisions of Anasazi culture, the Virgin Anasazi, those who lived along the Santa Clara Creek and the Virgin River, were the least known. Further east, the Kayenta and San Juan cultures had been studied in depth. In fact, the magnificent cliff dwellings at such places as Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado, Quetzal and Batatican in southeastern Utah, and the complex of pueblos at Chaco in northeastern New Mexico have become symbolic of the general ancestral Puebloan mystique. Yet, during the same time period, there were ancestral Puebloan people right here in the St. George Valley, a seemingly peaceful, small population of farmers who irrigated their corn, beans, and squash with water from what we now call the Santa Clara Creek and the Virgin River. They lived in pit houses and kept their sustenance in well-built storage chambers. They were excellent potters, creating beautiful black on white as well as black on red ceramics. But for some reason, perhaps lack of drama in their structures as compared to the awesome cliff dwellings to the east, they had been studied relatively little, and there was not much in the literature to even indicate they had existed. That was changing now as Gardner Daly, Doug McFadden, Richard Thompson, and many others were slowly becoming the resident experts on the Virgin Anasazi. These kinds of projects are very valuable to us, said Daly. They put a strain on all the other work we're required to do, but we've been fortunate to be able to get into some of these sites before they're gone. We still have a long way to go to catch up with what's been done east of us. For years, Richard Thompson had conducted a field school from SUU at different Anasazi sites in southern Utah and northern Arizona. The University of Utah and BYU had done field work here intermittently for several decades. The University of Nevada at Las Vegas was involved in excavation and research along the lower Virgin and Muddy River in Nevada. Abajo Archaeology out of Bluff, Utah, was excavating the site east of the town of Virgin on State Road 9 under contract with the State Department of Transportation. Slowly but surely, the body of knowledge about the Virgin Anasazi was growing. We're doing as much as we can while we can, said Daly. Most of what remains is along the waterways, which happen to be the areas where people nowadays want to build their houses too. Of the possible study sites along the Santa Clara Creek, Daly figured more than 90% were either privately owned, already built on, or otherwise unavailable for study. Still, he felt there was a suitable sample remaining. As we talked, Daly picked up a palmful of soil and sifted it through his fingers. It was part of a clay floor in the bottom of a cyst. A lot of people think we're out here looking for treasures, he said. They seem to think that it's pots and trinkets we're after. But that's just a very small part of it. In fact, we've found relatively few ceramics in these sites. We're looking for much more subtle clues, for evidence that illustrates the layers of different habitations on these sites. We've learned that different people inhabited these same buildings off and on for nearly 700 years, from around 500 AD to about 1200 AD. He squatted down and showed me how there were actually 2 rock linings around the hole, the original and one built later. 700 years, 2.5 times longer than the United States have been the United States. They came and went, raised their families, grew their corn, made their pots, lived their lives, and sustained their culture for nearly 3 times as long as we've been Americans. See this red clay lining, Daly said. He brushed his hand along a segment of the remaining plaster that once sealed stored corn from mice and mildew. This must have been a beautiful structure when it was built. There was pride of workmanship here. Daly explained that each of the small sites along the edge of the ridge had probably supported one family unit. Generally, each site had a pit house, which was the family shelter, and 2 or 3 storage cysts. The pit houses were dug 2 or 3 feet into the ground, then finished above ground with timbers and brush. The buildings were formed in semicircles oriented toward the southeast to take advantage of the morning sun in winter. There's certainly the excitement of discovery in this work, Daly said, but it's precise, tedious work that requires discipline and patience. We work through a site methodically teasing and extracting every particle of information we can. I noticed the loose-leaf binder filled with weathered papers sitting next to a metal folding chair. Daly pointed to it. We dig and write, he said, sift and sketch, move dirt and take pictures. We document everything, try to make the site talk to us, try to breathe life into the story. Daly hauled another shovelful of dirt out of the cyst. We're trying to write as full a history of these people as possible, he said. We've got to record everything accurately because as we go through a site like this, we completely destroy it, just as thoroughly as a bulldozer would. If we don't document, we haven't done our job. He squatted again in the hole and scraped at the floor with a small trowel. A moment later, he arose with a pinch of dark soil in his fingers. He was moving into an earlier layer of occupation. We're not just looking for things, he said. We're looking for things in context, how things relate with one another. We slowly, carefully, precisely dismantle these sites as we discover how they fit together. And when we're done, the developer will move in and the next layer of occupation will begin. Though Daly and McFadden were the only 2 professional archaeologists on the site, they were assisted almost daily by several volunteers who had been bitten by the archaeology bug. Each volunteer expressed to me a different reason for working at the site, but a common thread ran through all their responses, a desire to learn more about who the people were that inhabited this valley more than 1,000 years before the first Anglos got here. For years, people have tried to unlock the story by attempting to read the writings, the ancient ones left on rocks. Petroglyphs abound on the ledges, lining the wandering course of the Santa Clara Creek. Most of the glyphs were made by the Anasazi, and though many theories exist, no one really knows what they mean. My personal feeling, said Daly, is that the petroglyphs have strong religious connotations. They seem to be an attempt to communicate with deity. He is convinced that religion played a profound role in the lives of these people. They lived close to the land and were completely dependent upon it, beholden to the forces of nature. They had no way to buffer themselves against the vagaries of nature, he said. Their rock art looks to me like an attempt to strike deals with a god or gods. The sun rose higher and the day warmed around us. Gardner Daly pulled the ball cap from his head and pushed back his long, white, gray hair. He picked around in the rocks of the cyst, and I asked him if there was room for imagination in the mind of a trained archaeologist. His eyes seemed to widen behind his dark glasses, and a smile grew across his face. I know what you're getting at, he said. You can't help but want to read between the lines when you've been at this as long as I have. I suppose there are things my heart tells me about these people that are not necessarily provable by the meager evidence we have. There was a definite richness to this culture that does not show itself here. I don't get overly romantic about it. Certainly, it would be wonderful to be able to talk to them, to see them living here. That's the only way we could ever really know all we want to know about them. But I'm satisfied to work with what we have. We can't answer all the questions or know the full story, but we can keep building on what we've got. We're unearthing insights, and we've got new things to say, but we're far from resolving the puzzle. We shook hands again and said goodbye. I walked back toward my car and reluctantly took the long step from the dirt to the asphalt, from the ancient to today. As I crossed that mythical line, I was more aware than ever that I live in a place where people have lived long before my ancestors came. I went back to my daily duties with a new appreciation for and a deeper understanding of the landscape I call home.
Our people have been here for time immemorial, they say. Paiutes weren't a real fierce people. They could be angry, but they weren't a warlike people.
This is a piece I wrote many years ago entitled Sacred Places, Timeless Stories. Once when I was a kid, my dad took me for a ride in the truck through the Washington fields. We were probably going to look at a bull or a horse or somebody's stack of hay, but what I remember most about the ride was Dad pointing out a huge mound of land that jutted out of the landscape and stood inclined like a monument against the horizon. They call it Shinabkaib, Dad said. It's a sacred place for the Indians. I kept my eyes glued on that big mesa, wondering what made it sacred. It was a massive freestanding piece of earth that looked like it had just one day up and lifted out of the ground, like the top of a giant stenchers yawning into wide open position. The top of the mountain looked as flat as a table and sloped at a downward angle toward the southeast. I wondered how you would ever get to the top, and if you did, what you might find up there that made it so sacred. At that point in my life, I knew only two Native Americans. One was a friendly girl in my class at East Elementary. Her name was Dolly Snow. She came from what we called the Indian Farm, which was actually the Shivwits Indian Reservation west of Santa Clara. The other was a mysterious man my friends and I encountered quite often at the city park and around the Little League field in the summertime. I felt a certain kinship with the man because we shared the same name. His name was Lyman Smokey. Often we would see Smokey sitting under a tree at what is now Worthen Park on 4th East. We liked to approach him because he was friendly and seemed to enjoy talking to us. He was as slender as a rail, not very tall, and his eyes and hair were black as night. He spoke in a high-pitched voice, the way I remember it, and his hands and arms moved in graceful patterns as he talked. The voice and the circling hands are what I remember most, and those fluid, dark eyes that you could look into and never quite see to the bottom. The few short visits we had with Smokey during those years left a deep impression on me, not because I understood who or what he was, but most likely because this Native American, this native Southern Utah, was completely removed from what seemed natural to a freckle-faced kid whose culture was pretty well defined by Bugs Bunny cartoons, Cub Scout meetings, and Little League baseball. I distinctly remember the sharp prong of respect that poked at me each time we confronted Smokey. It might have been because of his name, but I think it had more to do with what was hiding deep inside those haunting eyes. There was something bright and hopeful and extremely wise locked inside those eyes. As I grew up, I remember hearing about him now and then. They said he had been to college, that he was gifted, that he was a wonderful artist. Everything I heard confirmed the things I had felt about him as a kid. A few years ago, I began to learn about the Southern Paiutes, of which the Shivwits are a band. I learned that by tradition, they are animists. They believe that everything that moves has life and that nature is in partnership with the people.
In our way of life, everything here is alive, even the rocks.
The clouds, the breeze, the fire, the water, they're all alive. And they believe that anger could make these elements destructive, so they sought constantly to appease and gain favor with them. Their gods had unlimited power, Tobats, the elder brother, and Shinab, the younger. Shinab. Where had I heard that name before? That's what Dad had called the big mesa in the Washington fields, Shinab Kaib. By now I knew that Kaib meant mountain, the mountain of God, God's mountain. All this time I'd been living beneath it and didn't even know it. There were stories, too. Many of them were saved and compiled by William R. Palmer in a book published in 1946, Why the North Star Stands Still and Other Indian Legends. One of my favorite legends from the book is the title story, Why the North Star Stands Still. It tells of Naga, the mountain sheep, who found a tall peak that reached to the clouds. Naga had never encountered a mountain he could not climb, but this one looked very difficult. He wanted to climb it and make his father, Shinab, very proud. He searched and searched for a way up the mountain and finally came upon a dark cave. He entered the cave and started upward through the darkness. The rocks slipped beneath his feet, crashing to the bottom of the shaft and sending up a thunderous noise. Soon, Naga grew fearful and decided to turn back. But then he saw that the rocks which had fallen had blocked the opening. There was no choice now but to keep climbing. After climbing for a long time, Naga finally saw a speck of light above him. Soon he emerged from the darkness and found himself on top of the mountain. Shinab was so proud of his son, he turned him into Putsi, a star. Naga became a star that every living thing can see, and the only star that will always be found in the same place. I wish I could talk to Lyman Smokey again. I'd like to hear him tell a story like that one, listen to his sharp voice, and watch his hands and arms roll gracefully through the air, and see the bright beam in those cold black eyes. Smokey is gone, but Shinab Kaib is still there and ever will be.
Our people used to be great in numbers. We had so many bands, but they're gone. They're all gone. The Tokerville people are all gone. They were wiped out. The Donequin people were all wiped out. When the Europeans came over, they brought their sicknesses, and the people were not used to that.
Now I'd like to share an encounter on Santa Clara Boulevard. During the first summer of COVID, I took long early morning walks beneath the sycamores along Santa Clara Boulevard. I'd pass the homes and lots and farmsteads of my ancestors and the other Swiss immigrants who settled there in the early 1860s. One morning, as I passed a house my great-great-grandfather built, I noticed a man a little further down the walk. He was painting on a concrete retaining wall along the sidewalk by the road. The wall's about 8 feet high and maybe 100 feet long. It holds back the foot of the hill that rises up to the Santa Clara Heights, upon which my house sits. As I drew nearer, I realized he was creating something very colorful and compelling on his blank concrete canvas. And as I drew even nearer, I realized he was a Native American, perhaps about my age. He wore denim jeans, a black t-shirt, and glasses much like mine. He was painting a giant circle using all the colors of the rainbow. Then I saw the detail in his painting, the various graphic figures and shapes and images and icons. There were already a dozen circles on the wall, each of them 4 or 5 feet in diameter. They ran the full course of the wall, each distinctly designed, each with its own color schemes, and each, it was obvious, telling a chapter in an ongoing story. I said hello to the man as I walked by. He nodded and returned a hello, hardly looking away from his work. I walked on down the sidewalk and had nearly reached the front lawn of the Jacob Hamlin home before I suddenly turned and started back. It was not a conscious decision. I simply turned on my heels and headed back. This time I introduced myself. The man stopped his work. His eyes turned slowly toward me. He graciously greeted me. He put down his paintbrush and told me his name was Daniel Growler. He was from the Cedar Band of Paiute. He lived in Cedar City, and he immediately named someone he went to school with who now lives in Santa Clara. He wondered if I knew him. I told him I did. I told him the name of a Paiute girl from the Shivwits Band that I'd gone to school with. He knew her, too. We talked for a while. His voice was soft and gentle and sincere and passed into my ears as naturally as the breeze. He told me he'd been asked by the mayor of Santa Clara to paint a mural on this retaining wall. The story he was bringing to life on that long gray strip of concrete was sacred to his people. He told me each circle represented a step in the path of life, from the world we came from to the world we now live in, to the world that awaits us. Those few minutes with Daniel were extraordinary. There was so much I wanted to express to him about his art, about his people, about how grateful I felt that he would share his talent and his story in such a meaningful way. I tried to tell him how I admire and respect the Southern Paiute people. It came out of my mouth fully sincere, but as I heard what I was saying, it seemed lacking, and I wished there were a way for him to truly know how I felt. The way he responded and the way the light glimmered in his eyes gave me comfort, though I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable about how comfortably I live on land that has been the land of his people for centuries. I wish there were a way to express to him that I feel native to this place myself, that I was born here, which is the root sense of the word native, and that my father was born here, and his father, and his father, and that the father before that and his father came here after giving up everything they owned in Europe. They came here with nothing and made a place where I could be born with everything. And I'm the 6th generation, and my children are the 7th, and their children the 8th. And just exactly at what point can you begin to believe you are native? Yet, who am I to call myself native when Daniel can trace his roots in this place back centuries? It's easy to try to justify it all with the argument that someone else took my ancestors' land from them. Isn't it true that human beings have been playing an aggressive game of musical chairs from the time Adam and Eve came out of the garden. But that's no justification for ignoring the legacy of those who were here before us, or realizing what our coming here did to them, or doing all we can to honor and respect and remember them, and be better neighbors in every sense of the word, and lift and strengthen and love and find joy together. I congratulated Daniel Growler on his amazing and inspiring art. I thanked him for doing it and told him it would always remind me of him and the great people who were here for centuries before my people came, and who are still here, living their lives in the land of their ancestors. I told him I hoped his work would have the same effect on thousands of people. As I walked away, I prayed he would know and feel and understand how sincerely I felt, even though my words could not come close to expressing it. And then I realized I was passing the lane that leads to an unmarked place at the foot of the hill. I stopped a moment and scanned the slope along the base of the hill where it levels onto the valley floor, and tried to imagine where they would have dug a grave along that slope. Wherever it is where my great-great-great-grandfather is believed to be buried.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.